Good morning and welcome to Closing the Distance. I'm Jeff Meyers, senior pastor here at Roswell Presbyterian Church, and I'm here with Debra Weir, the recently retired associate director of the Center for Spirituality and Lifelong Learning at Columbia Theological Seminary, a very spiritual woman who I've known for a long time, learned a lot from. Debra, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, glad to be here, Jeff. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So, and we're going to talk about fasting in particular today, but you have a lot of experience with a lot of the disciplines that we've been talking about here at the church during the season of Lent. How did you get into and get interested in spiritual practices and spiritual discipline?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting story. I think, I don't know, they were sort of on my radar kind of in early adulthood through small group Bible studies and things like that. And I suppose you could say that small group Bible studies and things were, a big part of spiritual practice in those early years. But we were actually in one early on, my husband and I, that you did a study and we had a conversation, and then it invited you to do something different during the week. You actually had to act out something. I can't remember what it was. Maybe it was like an act of service. One week was about service and you had to do something for somebody and come back and report on it. So that sort of study, learning, action piece was kind of built in early on in my adult life as a Christian. And it just sort of grew from there, more learning. In the 80s, 90s, Richard Foster was writing, so we were studying his work, and there was a lot in there that really resonated with me around practice. So, you'd pick something up and you'd try it for a while and do that and then move on. I think in terms of really going deeper with spiritual practice, that really came later. In midlife, we made a big change. We were part of a congregation that was very missional in California, and we were really inspired by people going around the world and serving. And so this idea that we might become a part of something bigger in that kind of service-oriented way was part of that journey. The surprising gift maybe was that the journey was really hard. I mean, I had to really kind of rethink my faith, what I understood about how God worked in my life, in the lives of other people, and in the world, and it really brought me back to the need for spiritual practice, my own need for God, and for really turned me toward an inward journey. Been on this outer journey, and so it turned me inward. I had to really reflect on my life. What did I believe? Not just what the church told me and I could repeat about faith. And so I had to think about how God related to me. And the way through that was spiritual practice, a lot of solitude, more reading, more, engagement with different practices and different communities, being met with people who were on similar journeys, struggling in the kind of challenges of life as they present themselves, and wrestling with how to engage with faith in the midst of that.
Yeah, so I was thinking, like, you're somebody, I mean, we all wear a lot of different hats, but you've really worn a lot of different hats. I mean, wife, mother, you guys have lived all over the world. I mean, you guys lived in Thailand for some time, right?
Yeah, we lived in Thailand for 8 years, and we lived in Sri Lanka for 2. So, and then several places in the United States as well. So,
did you find certain spiritual practices helpful at various stages or times, or did you kind of just practice them all kind of randomly?
That's a good question. If I were to come back to anything particularly that's consistent for me, that's maybe more interesting right now. But I think the consistent thread for me is really solitude. finding a way to have enough solitude in a day. Even now, I'm retired, so I have all this time, right? I still need a lot of solitude, and I just appreciate it even more now, I think, than I did before, when I, had 16 other things that I was thinking about to move into my day. But it's really important for me to quiet all the outer voices and the competing inner voices, to listen deeply within to my own voice and the voice of God, and how we connect.
Right.
So
Wow.
yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, and that's kind of, as I've been researching and reading, it seems like all the practices kind of are birthed in solitude. That solitude seems to be kind of like the foundation, that centering prayer, meditation, settling yourself down. And I think there may be like nothing more prophetic in the constant noise and busyness that we are thrown into in our culture, and that we valorize. If you say, I'm going to go spend time doing nothing, people will just be like, you're useless, right? And and so it's very prophetic to even just hear that it's important to find solitude in the midst of the busyness and hubbub of life. Okay, so we want to focus in on fasting. How would you define the spiritual practice of fasting?
Yeah. So spiritual practice of fasting is abstaining from, in a traditional sense, abstaining from food for a spiritual purpose. And the last piece, for a spiritual purpose, is really the important piece of that. So in a way, I sort of see my practice of solitude as a fasting practice of sorts, fasting from interaction with other people. And if I look broadly, I think about practice of Sabbath, taking a whole day, away from everything, as a kind of fasting practice. So abstaining from something in a broader sense. But for this spiritual purpose.
Right. And I've been saying, like, oftentimes the practices are, you're saying no to something that's good. It's not that you're saying no to bad things. Sometimes we have to do that, but oftentimes the spiritual practice is saying no to something that's good in order to say yes to a greater good, and just kind of set those things aside and abstain to achieve a spiritual good that you couldn't otherwise. And I've been thinking, I didn't preach yesterday, and Lindsay and I spent a lot of time kind of talking in preparation for the sermon. And we talked about how, in the first century, people's relationship with food was very different than our like North American relationship with food. Like, it was like you couldn't roll to the local Whole Foods, and pick up your quinoa, like, vegetable bowl, with 1,000 different, it was scarce. Food was scarce. And so I was thinking, so what ways can we practice fasting in a healthy way in our modern kind of contemporary world?
Yeah. So there is a sense of food. I mean, in some ways, I feel like food is so accessible here. It's almost an addiction. And so anyway, it's surprising when you give it up, how much that opens up. So there's that piece. And so I think if we want to think about fasting in a broad sense, what are we going to give up for Lent, for instance? What is that thing? Because we're conditioned into this rhythm of eating, a pattern of eating, sometimes conscious and sometimes unconscious. We have other things that are patterned into our lives. And we can choose one of those. So it's likely to be different. So it might require some self-examination. What are noticing, the things that are kind of patterned into your life, like reading. So it's so easy these days to always have reading and to turn our attention to our phone or to, whatever we're carrying. It's like, oh, well, I'm bored, I'm going to read, right? Well, what if we caught ourselves and said, no, I'm not going to read right now. I'm going to turn this moment into a moment of prayer and we switch the rhythm from turning to reading to turning to prayer. So that's an example.
Yeah.
And, there are plenty of other things, we can notice pattern of buying things. Amazon is a finger push away.
Yep.
And so, what are the things that you purchase with regularity, and to stop purchasing that for a period of time. And what do you notice about that? I think that's another piece of these kinds of practices, is the self-reflective piece. So one is, what do you notice about that when you stop yourself from reaching for something that would be ultimately good and enjoyable, pleasurable, right?
Yeah.
But we interrupt the pattern, we interrupt it. And anyway, so what do we learn from that? And then the other piece is the turning our attention toward God. Maybe we need help. Maybe it's that first prayer of help that we have to ask for. Stop me.
Yeah.
But it's confessional. It raises these questions, of, well, why is this so easy for me to do all the time? And I don't notice it until I decide not to. Yeah.
I think you said something. Actually, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, but I feel like, why not? It was like the other day, I was on Instagram, and they got this, new Reels function. It's like it's supposed to be competing with TikTok. They're like 10-second, 20-second kind of little meeting videos, and I just kept like flipping through.
Yeah.
And then I realized a half hour had gone by, and I had not even thought about it. I just got it sucked in.
Yeah.
I was like, I can't get any of that time back in my life.
Exactly.
And we are creatures who get patterned, and our attention is drawn away, and we don't even become conscious of our lives.
Yeah.
So if fasting is abstaining from certain things, and I love you bring up consumerism and Amazon. You're kind of stepping on my toes there. But like, okay, how do we go through the process really practically of discerning what God is calling us to abstain from? Maybe this week, if we're going to practice fasting during this week.
Well, so I do think it is a matter of prayer. So I think it's both prayer and observation. I think most people probably already have a sense of some things that they, could probably do less of or let go of for a period of time. And so that's obviously a good place to start. But if you're not sure, I think there's a prayerful practice, as we name things that you might get let go of, praying about these, with sitting down with God and saying, these are some things that I think I could let go of for a period of time, depending on what you're trying to achieve. But, and then just, in the end, you just have to run with one. You can narrow the field. And then if you can't decide, you said, well, I'm just going to go with this one and see what I learn. I think this life of spiritual practice is really a journey, and it's interesting and kind of fun to try new things, to swap up, change the rhythms of our life, swap things out, swap things back in. And it shifts things. We learn things we wouldn't learn otherwise.
So I like the point you made here. It's okay to shift and change and give up certain things, take them back on. And that's really important, I think, because I think there's some of us who are wired like, I've got to find the right way to do this spiritual practice. There's one way, and I got to figure it out. And then that's going to solve all my problems. And that's what you're saying is not going to work. Some of it. So we can get caught in that kind of pattern of getting hung up on particular practices. And, and sometimes it just runs dry for us. God doesn't meet us there anymore. And actually, I think God invites us into something new, to step over into something new, and will speak to us in a new way. And so we have to, look for that piece. But
also can become this matter of pride. It's like, well, this is my spiritual practice and I do this every day and I'm really good and regular. Well, sometimes it's good to just let go of that too,
Yeah, that was about the point of pride. And I think we may have talked about this in a previous episode, but for a long time, spiritual practices were known as a Catholic thing, as a Roman Catholic
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
And it was seen, Luther's kind of critique and a lot of Protestant critiques after that were that, this practices were a source of pride. Look how what I'm a spiritual athlete. Well, look at how,
Yeah.
how spiritually strong I am, how I can earn God's approval or whatever it might be. And I think, in a lot of ways, through the work of Richard Foster and his book, Celebration of Discipline, recovering the practices, but then saying it's not a source of pride, but it's about deepening your spirituality. You're intentionally entering into a deeper relationship with God. And it's not about human ego and becoming, some spiritual weightlifter, but rather entering into God's presence and be opening yourself up to God's grace even and God's love even more fully. Which I think is just a really important thing to understand, because we're just like so we just are given to pride. Like Lewis talks about, we become, in the Screw Tape Letters, we become prideful about how humble we are.
Yeah.
So if you think a couple things I want to say. So I knew a couple, this husband and wife, they used to have every night while they cooked dinner, they had a couple glasses of wine. And so one Lent, they gave up wine. And they said they had no idea how attached they were to this thing until they gave it up. I was thinking, I deleted the Facebook app on my phone. And I had no idea how I absentmindedly would just open it up and start reading it, and how it was just so distracting for the rest of my life. And once I deleted it, all of a sudden I became more attentive to so many other things that were happening in my life and relationships. It was really, really helpful. What other kinds of spiritual benefits can we expect from fasting? I know that's tricky because we're not. So help me understand.
We're not all the same, for starters. But I think it depends a little bit on what you're fasting from. Time is one thing. It opens up time and space to be spent otherwise, whether it's in prayer specifically or, we have choices to make with that time. And I think it is an awareness piece. So this gift of greater self-awareness, like you said, I push the Facebook app 90 times a day and without thinking about it, or I get sucked into it, that kind of thing. And to notice that. I think with some things, I think fasting from food can, I was thinking about this today, we become aware of our hunger and to begin to replace our hunger for food with our hunger for God, to say, oh, I'm feeling hunger right now. And maybe it's a prayer, how am I hungry for God? And how do I follow that hunger? And that journey would be a really interesting journey to take. Food itself, just because it kind of weakens the way we normally do, I just think it opens a lot of territory for self-awareness, how we respond to people, our body we might feel a little off and more tired. And so our kindness genes may go underground for a while, that kind of thing.
It's so funny. I remember I was in this is me 10 years ago. I was in Egypt, in Cairo, and for like 10 days, and we were touring around, and it was during Ramadan. Okay, so Muslims don't, they fast from sun up to sundown during the day, and I noticed people in the marketplace, people on the street were just like arguing and getting in fights and stuff. And I asked our tour guy, I said, everybody is so aggressive. I had no idea. He said, well, that's because it's Ramadan. and you got a lot of people who aren't eating and who aren't smoking during the day, and they're very irritated. So I said, so be careful.
Yeah.
That is so fun. Okay, so what are some resources we could turn to that maybe have been helpful to you, that you've recommended to others in our spiritual practices? That could be specifically fasting, but maybe also more broadly.
Oh, sure. So specifically around fasting, I do have Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline, because he does such a nice, extensive look at fasting itself. I also thought of a devotional book. What's the name of it? Living the Christian Year, Bobby Gross's book, Living Through the Year. And so in the season of Lent, there's a section on fasting, which I think is really, really helpful in a maybe a more contemporary sense.
And that's a really good book.
It is.
Especially for, just in general, but especially
just
for
in general,
who don't have any familiarity with the liturgical year and the rhythms of it. Why do we have Lent? Why do we have Advent? Epiphany, these kinds of things. That's a very good introduction. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Another book that comes to mind that I have enjoyed in the last couple of years is a book by Christine Baltner's Paintner. It's called Sacred Time, and it just takes a really lovely, gentle, and wide view of how we view time and how we organize our life around time, from the simple rhythms of breathing to practicing Sabbath to consecrating time in various ways. It's anyway, it connects with the natural world and cycles of the moon, and the whole range of things.
Okay, and that's called Sacred Time.
Sacred Time.
What's the author? Who's the author?
Christine Baltner's Paintner.
Oh wow! Okay, I'm not familiar with them.
She has a website, Abbey of the Arts website. She's fairly. She's pretty well known in some circles.
I'm just learning. I'm just.
I know. There's so much out there. You have to learn new things all the time.
Now, are you a spiritual director?
Yeah, I am.
I thought you were trained. Okay, and I think I was not familiar with the ministry really of spiritual directing. Until I, fairly late in my ministry, unfortunately. So could you say a bit about what a spiritual director does and when it might be good for someone to meet with a spiritual director?
Oh, sure. So the ministry, it's a practice and a ministry. So the practice of spiritual direction, of course, has been really important in my life. But the practice itself and the ministry is really a ministry of listening. So you meet with a spiritual director and you're both really listening for the presence and activity of God kind of in the conversation, but also in whatever someone brings to the conversation. So how is God present and active in this? And there are pieces where a spiritual director might encourage you to practice spiritual disciplines of various kinds. It's all kind of voluntary, because the idea is we want the person to orient toward God. The real director is always the Holy Spirit or God, however you would name that. And so we really want to orient you to the leading of the Spirit. And I would say that the other thing is it's a lot about discernment. How do we discern the movement of God in our lives? And how, we talk about hearing and obeying. Once we've heard a word from God, we can't help but obey or follow. And so how do we hear that word and how do we follow? And then, of course, what happens then, out of that kind of deep listening, that faithful listening, faithful following, step by step. So it's a companion on this spiritual journey of faithfulness.
Cool. I would encourage folks that that are listening, if this is something that sounds interesting to you, how would they seek out a spiritual director?
Well, there are many ways. You could You could look broadly. A lot of people are doing online direction too. So you could, well, I would ask people that you know. That would be number one, so call Jeff Meyers, start with people you know. Do you know any spiritual directors, and how can I reach out to them? So start there. Or a second piece maybe to call the spirituality program at Columbia Seminary. They generally have a list there of local spiritual directors. And that's kind of how you start. There's an international organization called Spiritual Directors International that also has a listing of people who have joined that organization. And it's you can search it by location,
Okay.
Geographic location. So it's not too overwhelming, but it's a long list. And you don't necessarily know much about them. But once you start asking questions, more names will come up and all of that.
Okay.
And I do suggest that people interview more than one person. Just because your best friend goes to one director doesn't mean you should go to the same person. You want to have someone that you feel comfortable with and just feels like a good fit. It's kind of intuitive. So
that makes a lot of sense. Okay, that's good. Yeah, people feel free to reach out to me and I can help connect you if spiritual directing is interesting, if someone's interested in it who's listening. Okay, so you just retired as the associate director for the Center for Spirituality at Columbia Theological Seminary. What does the Center for Spirituality do? What's their mission?
So the spirituality program offers programs, courses, retreats that encourage spiritual growth in people. Also with an intent that people would become leaders in their congregations. So it is both for pastors and lay people. Most of those programs include some of both, which is a really lovely mix because in that context, it's not your pastor, it's other pastors if you're a lay person. And you can see how they are just regular people like we are. And pastors get a chance to relax and lay people get a chance to lead sometimes. So it's really a lovely space. And it really is about connecting your spirit with God's spirit. It's a retreat and learning space that weaves things together in unique ways and nourishes the spirit.
Wonderful.
So I would say there are a couple of certificate programs. One is in spiritual formation. So it's more kind of about the general spiritual journey and perhaps kind of leading, teaching things. So you're introduced to practices, and I think it's modeled in a way where you learn how to lead. So if you're a teacher, you pick that stuff up. And then there's also a certificate in spiritual direction program. So people who have been in direction and discern that might be a next step in their life and ministry. You could apply to that program as well.
Wow. I don't think a lot of people know about this like great treasure chest of spirituality to really grow. And I can think of a lot of folks that would be really interested. So, well, Debra, our time has come to an end, but thank you so much for talking to us about spiritual disciplines and fasting. Your ministry has meant so much to me over the years. And so it's just really fun to kind of celebrate it in a public way. And I just thank you so much for being with us and help us close the distance with one another and with God. Be well, and I hope to see you soon.
Great. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Debra. We'll see everybody next Monday at noon. Take care, Debra. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.